Open Book Chapter 1, The Letter in the Afternoon Sun, Opening Scene. The afternoon sun lay softly over Marlecombe, a village of neat hedgerows and gossiping windows. Gertrude Pike, postmistress for nearly 20 years, stood at her counter sorting letters with a practiced hand. Outside, the scent of late roses drifted on a breeze that carried with it the faint sound of a lawnmower. Miss Jane Marple, lately arrived from St. Mary Mead to visit her old friend Mrs. Linton, paused at the doorway of the post office. She carried a small basket and wore an expression of pleasant curiosity, the sort that concealed a mind as sharp as a silver pin. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," called Gertrude, sliding a stack of envelopes aside. "You've just missed the excitement. Someone's left a most peculiar letter in Mr. Hargreaves' box. No stamp, no return address." Miss Marple tilted her head. How very odd. A letter without a sender is often the most interesting kind. Before either could speak further, a cry rang out from across the green. A gardener sprinted from the vicarage gate, face pale, shouting that Mr. Hargreaves, the retired judge who kept the grand house on the hill, had been found in his study, locked in from the inside. And very much dead. Miss Marple's basket dipped slightly in her hand, though her eyes remained calm. She had come for a peaceful fortnight in Marlecombe. It seemed, however, that the village had other plans. Chapter 2, Shock at the Vicarage. Marlecombe had always prided itself on being the sort of place where nothing truly alarming ever occurred. There were petty arguments about the flower rota in the church porch, occasional rumours of a fox in the hen runs, and, once, a dramatic but ultimately harmless fire in the blacksmith shed. Murder, however, was something that belonged to the sensational pages of the London newspapers, not to the vicarage lawn on a mild September afternoon. Yet there it was. Judge Hargreaves lay lifeless in his study, the door locked on the inside, curtains drawn against the gentle sun. Constable Pierce, the only officer in the village, had hurried from the post office as soon as the gardener's cry had reached him. He now stood awkwardly on the gravel path, cap clutched in both hands, trying to look authoritative while keeping the cluster of worried villagers from pressing too near the threshold. Miss Marple, who had witnessed many such gatherings in St. Mary Mead, regarded the scene with mild interest. She had taken up a discreet position near the lilac bushes, where she could observe both faces and footsteps. Her friend Mrs. Linton, flustered and pale, hovered at her elbow. "I can't believe it, Jane," Mrs. Linton whispered. "Only yesterday the judge was telling the Mothers' Union about his roses." Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic nod. "Yes, my dear. Death seldom waits for an appointment." Her eyes travelled slowly over the group, Mrs. Pike from the post office, two young maids from the vicarage kitchen, the doctor striding up from the lane. Everyone seemed genuinely stunned, yet one or two expressions lingered on the study windows with a touch more calculation than shock. Inside, the vicar himself emerged from the hallway looking solemn. "Dr. Evans is with him now," he said, voice hushed. "Pierce, we mustn't allow anyone else in until the proper authorities arrive." "Quite right, sir," the constable replied, though he glanced nervously at Miss Marple as if seeking confirmation. Her gentle smile offered neither approval nor criticism, only quiet encouragement to carry on. A murmur ran through the onlookers when Dr. Evans appeared, brushing dust from his sleeves. "He's gone," the doctor said. "Dead for at least an hour, perhaps 2. He hesitated. "There's no sign of forced entry. Everything in the room is undisturbed, save for a chair tipped on its side." Mrs. Pike's hand flew to her mouth. "And that letter. He came for it this morning, I know he did. Oh, I wish I'd never mentioned it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Letter?" she asked gently. Mrs. Pike, remembering herself, flushed. Oh, just an odd envelope left in his box. No stamp, no name. I told him at once, but he only smiled and put it in his pocket." The doctor frowned. "Envelope, you say? H.M." He looked as though he meant to pursue the matter, but at that moment the low purr of a motorcar approached along the lane. All eyes turned as a dark saloon came to a stop, and out stepped a tall man in a neat tweed coat. "Inspector Harrow, County Police," he announced, holding out a leather wallet. "I understand there's been a death." Miss Marple watched the inspector's gaze sweep the gathering, steady, assessing, not unkind. He gave curt instructions. The body was to remain untouched, the room secured. He requested statements from those who had last seen the judge alive. Constable Pierce looked relieved to be given direction. As Harrow entered the house, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest sigh. She had no desire to interfere with official business. Nevertheless, her keen mind could not resist noting the quick glance the inspector threw towards the postmistress, and the way Mrs. Linton anxiously adjusted her shawl whenever the locked door was mentioned. People, she reflected, rarely realized how much they gave away when tragedy struck. The vicar invited the shaken neighbors into the drawing-room for tea. Miss Marple followed at a sedate pace, settling near a tall window where she could see both the room and the garden beyond. As cups clinked and whispers fluttered like nervous birds, she sat very still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Somewhere in this peaceful village afternoon, she thought, lay the reason for a judge's death behind a bolted door, and perhaps the meaning of an anonymous letter, posted without a stamp. She did not yet know how the two might connect, but experience told her that patience, and a careful ear for village chatter, would soon set the threads in motion. Chapter 3. Inspector Harrow Arrives. Inspector Leonard Harrow stood for a moment in the hall of the vicarage, adjusting the brim of his hat as his eyes swept over the carved oak panels and the neat umbrella stand. The place had the air of order that he associated with solid, respectable households, the sort where little ever happened beyond tea trays and committee meetings. That made the scene awaiting him in the study all the more jarring. "Best keep the others back, Constable," he said over his shoulder. "I'd like a clear look at things before people trample evidence." Miss Marple, who had taken a seat in a high-backed chair near the drawing-room door, watched the inspector pass with quiet interest. She noted the calm efficiency of his stride and the way he carried a small notebook already half open in his hand. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a face made serious by long hours and a certain innate caution. Inside the study, sunlight slipped between the curtains, striping the carpet in pale gold. The body of Judge Hargreaves lay slumped beside the great walnut desk, his head turned slightly, one arm outstretched as if he had tried to grasp something in his final moment. A chair nearby had tipped onto its side, and a faint smell of scorched paper hung in the air. Harrow bent to examine the latch on the inside of the door. "Locked," he murmured. "Key still in place." He tried the bolt, finding it stiff but workable. Then he crouched beside the corpse, his expression tightening as he studied the angle of the judge's head and the faint bruising along the collar of his shirt. "No obvious weapon," he said to Dr. Evans, who hovered by the bookcase. "Could be poison, but there's a mark here, see." He indicated a narrow bruise, almost hidden by the folds of the judge's cravat. "Something thin, perhaps a cord." Evans nodded slowly. "Heart trouble might have carried him off, but I shouldn't like to sign a certificate just yet." The inspector's attention shifted to the desk. A few papers were neatly stacked, but one corner of blotting paper was singed, curling slightly as though it had caught a flame and been hastily stamped out. Beside it stood a silver letter knife, its point darkened by soot. No envelope lay in sight. Returning to the hall, Harrow beckoned Constable Pierce. "Keep everyone in the drawing-room for the present. I'll take statements one at a time." Mrs. Linton, wringing her hands, asked if tea might be served to calm nerves. Harrow granted permission with a brief nod. He seemed to understand the value of small comforts even amidst tragedy. Miss Marple, still seated quietly, offered the inspector a polite smile when he approached. "You're Miss Marple, I believe? A visitor here?" "Yes, Inspector. I am staying with Mrs. Linton for a fortnight." "You heard the gardener raise the alarm." "I did indeed," she said, her voice mild. "Mr. Hargreaves had gone inside to fetch a document, I think, while the others admired the dahlias. We were waiting for him on the lawn when young Fletcher came running, quite distressed." Harrow scribbled a note, then looked at her more keenly. "You've seen a good many things, Miss Marple. Anything strike you as odd about the scene?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled just a fraction. "Only that the judge was a man who valued tidiness. I should not expect to find a letter half burned upon his blotter unless something had greatly disturbed him." The inspector paused, pencil poised, then inclined his head. "That's helpful." He moved on to question the others, but Miss Marple sensed she had made an impression. As the afternoon waned, Harrow finished his first round of inquiries. Gerald Hargreaves, the judge's nephew, arrived from the station house, breathless and dishevelled. He claimed he had been in London all morning and had only just returned to find chaos at his uncle's door. Harrow listened, expression unreadable. By early evening the body had been removed to the undertaker, and the inspector issued instructions for the room to remain locked until the county pathologist could examine it. Villagers drifted away reluctantly, subdued by the weight of events. Only Miss Marple lingered by the front gate, watching the inspector as he jotted a final note before slipping behind the wheel of his car. There was, she thought, a steadiness about Inspector Harrow that boded well for the inquiry. Yet she could not help sensing that the solution to Judge Hargreaves' death would require more than procedural skill. Somewhere among the roses and the gossip of Marlacombe lay a thread invisible to official eyes, but not, she hoped, to her own. Chapter 4. Teacups and First Clues. Late afternoon sunlight slanted across Mrs. Linton's small parlour, turning the chintz curtains a warm rose. The tea table, hastily laid after the inspector's departure, offered a comforting picture. Blue and white cups, a plate of seed cake, a pot steaming gently. Yet the conversation around it was anything but comfortable. Mrs. Linton, hands fluttering like anxious birds, poured tea for her guest. Such a dreadful day, Jane. I feel I shan't sleep tonight at all. Miss Marple accepted her cup with a quiet word of thanks. She sat perfectly upright in the armchair, her eyes thoughtful behind the soft folds of her hat. Yes, my dear. Sudden death always shakes one, and a locked room adds a curious chill. Across from them, Mrs. Pike from the post office perched on the sofa, plainly reluctant to leave for her own supper. It's that letter that bothers me, she said, twisting a handkerchief. I ought never to have told the judge. But it was odd, you see, no stamp, no handwriting, just typed words, for your eyes only. Did you notice anything about the paper? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Pike shook her head. Heavy stock, I think. I didn't open it, of course. Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on the teacups, then on Mrs. Pike's fingers, reddened by years of sorting letters. She said nothing more, only added another sugar lump to her tea and stirred slowly. After a while the doctor came in, brushing dust from his coat. Harrow's gone back to headquarters, he told them. He'll return in the morning. He asked me to keep an eye on you ladies, and to remind you not to go wandering near the vicarage tonight. Mrs. Linton sighed. As if we would. I only wish poor Hargreaves had told someone about that wretched note. Dr. Evans nodded gravely. He didn't mention it to me at luncheon, though I saw him reading something at the table. Looked troubled, but he waved it off. Miss Marple set down her spoon with the air of one filing a fact away. You know, it often happens, she remarked, that a person hides concern behind a little laugh. I've known people to keep the most alarming letters quite private, almost as if sharing them would make them real. The others looked at her with interest, but she only smiled faintly and took a bite of cake. Presently Mrs. Pike rose to go, promising to return if the inspector needed her statement again. Miss Marple accompanied her to the door. The village lay bathed in the last glow of daylight, cottages standing prim and proper as though murders were foreign to their walls. Only the distant toll of the church bell reminded them of the judge's sudden passing. Walking back to the parlour, Miss Marple paused by the hall stand. A small spray of ink flecks stained the cuff of her own glove, picked up, perhaps, from the judge's desk when she had bent near the body. She removed the glove thoughtfully. Curious, she murmured almost to herself. Ink, and just where man might lean if he were writing in haste. When she rejoined Mrs. Linton, her manner was placid as ever, yet inside her mind the tiny pieces had begun to arrange themselves. An unstamped envelope, a smouldered scrap on a blotter, and a judge who valued order more than most. There was, she felt sure, a story behind that letter, and the story might well lead to a killer. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Green. Morning broke over Marlacombe with a gentle mist, softening the edges of hedgerows and giving the village green a dreamy haze. From her bedroom window at Mrs. Linton's, Miss Marple watched as shopkeepers set out baskets of apples and late plums, and a pair of schoolchildren scurried past, their satchels bumping at their sides. On the surface, it was an ordinary day. Only the quiet undercurrent of talk, carried on the crisp air, hinted at the trouble lodged in the heart of the village. When she came down for breakfast, Mrs. Linton was already at the table, buttering toast with unnecessary vigour. They've been at it since dawn, she said, nodding towards the window. Fletcher says the women outside the baker's are talking of nothing but poor Judge Hargreaves. Miss Marple smiled faintly, pouring tea. News, like the mist, settles everywhere in a small place. After the meal she decided on a slow stroll around the green. Her knitting bag dangled from her wrist, though no one expected her to produce needles just yet. It was, as ever, a useful pretext for observing without seeming to pry. The usual morning congregation was in place, Mrs. Pike arranging postcards in the post office window, old Mr. Griggs leaning on his stick by the pump, two housemaids whispering behind their aprons. As Miss Marple passed, she caught fragments of conversation. Said there was a quarrel about the will. Heard the judge meant to leave everything to some charity. And that nephew of his, storming out last month. She paused to greet Mrs. Pike, who looked harried by the constant questions of customers. It's a mercy you don't handle murder inquiries every week, my dear, Miss Marple observed kindly. Oh, don't you start, Mrs. Pike said, though she looked pleased at the sympathy. Everyone wants to know if I still have that letter. As if I'd keep such a thing after handing it straight over to him. Quite right, Miss Marple replied. But people are apt to imagine that evidence lingers in convenient drawers. By the duck pond she encountered young Fletcher, the gardener who had raised the alarm. He stood with a rake in hand, eyes darting. I didn't mean to shout so, miss, he said, tugging his cap. Only, I'd never seen a man, well, like that before. You behaved sensibly, Miss Marple assured him. Tell me, did you notice anyone near the study window as you came across the lawn? Fletcher hesitated. Thought I saw a sleeve, grey, maybe, slipping behind the hedge, but I can't rightly swear. Could have been my nerves. She thanked him and walked on, thoughtful. Near the gate of Rose Cottage, she found Miss Redfern, the librarian, clipping faded blooms from her roses. The woman looked up, cheeks pink in the cool air. Terrible business, isn't it? Miss Redfern murmured. They say the judge had papers about some old court case locked in his desk. Perhaps someone didn't want them seen. Miss Marple listened without comment, filing away each scrap of talk. Gossip, she knew, was like dandelion seed. Some bits were nonsense, but a few carried truth if one watched where they landed. As she returned to Mrs. Linton's for luncheon, the church bell tolled the half-hour. The mist was lifting, leaving the roofs sharp against a clear September sky. Somewhere behind those orderly chimneys and well-tended gardens, she thought, lay a person who had feared discovery enough to risk everything, and who now watched the village just as carefully as she did. Chapter 6. The Nephew's Alibi. Inspector Harrow returned to Marlecombe before noon, his motorcar drawing up smartly before the vicarage gate. He stepped out with a purposeful air, a sheaf of papers under one arm, and paused a moment to survey the quiet street. Behind lace curtains and half-open doors, faces withdrew hastily. The village was behaving exactly as a village does when scandal has crept in, pretending to go about its business while every ear is strained for news. Miss Marple, already abroad with her knitting bag, crossed the lane to greet him. Good morning, Inspector. I trust you found a satisfactory breakfast at the Crown. Harrow allowed a faint smile. Adequate, thank you. I've been to the station. Gerald Hargreaves arrived on the early train from London, looking rather worse for wear. He claims he spent yesterday morning in the city, attending to legal matters. Convenient, murmured Miss Marple. The inspector raised an eyebrow but said only, I intend to confirm it. I'd like you present while I speak with him again. You seem to have a knack for putting people at ease. They found Gerald waiting in the vicar's small study. He was a tall young man, untidily handsome, with shadows under his eyes and a tension about the mouth that suggested sleeplessness. He rose quickly when they entered. Inspector, I've told you all I know, he began. I was in London on business, a meeting with my solicitor about a partnership. I came back on the 5 o'clock train and went straight to the house. Harrow seated himself opposite, laying his notebook on the table. Mr. Hargreaves, our information shows no one else had access to your uncle's study after 11. The gardener saw you arriving by car shortly after 6. Can anyone in London confirm your whereabouts between 10 and 3? Gerald hesitated, fingers tightening on the arm of his chair. I lunched at my club. I may have gone for a walk along the embankment afterwards. I didn't keep receipts. Miss Marple observed him over the rim of her spectacles. His voice carried genuine distress, yet beneath it she sensed another layer, not guilt exactly, but the unease of someone with more to hide than mere gaps in an itinerary. You and your uncle were fond of each other, she asked gently. Yes, that is, mostly. Gerald's face softened, then clouded. He could be severe. We argued last month about the estate. He wanted to endow some sort of scholarship. I felt the house ought to remain in the family. That quarrel became heated. Harrow pressed. I suppose it did. Gerald rubbed his temple. But I never wished him harm, I swear it. Harrow studied him for a moment, then closed the notebook. Very well. I'll check your story with your solicitor. Until then, I advise you not to leave the village. After Gerald had gone, the inspector glanced at Miss Marple. What do you make of him? She smiled faintly, folding her hands on her knitting bag. I think, Inspector, that Mr. Gerald Hargreaves may be telling the truth, though not necessarily the whole of it. He is protecting someone, or something, quite as much as he is protecting himself. Harrow frowned, considering this. Then we must find out what. Miss Marple rose, her eyes resting briefly on the window, where villagers passed in twos and threes, heads together in earnest talk. Yes, she said softly. But perhaps we should look not only at what he has said, but at what he has taken such care not to say. Chapter 7. A Visit to the Post Office. A thin autumn sun brightened Marlecombe the next morning, glinting off wet cobblestones and sending little plumes of steam from the baker's oven. Miss Marple, shawl neatly pinned, walked at a gentle pace along the village street. She carried a folded shopping list, but in truth her destination was decided, the post office, that small hub where letters, parcels, and rumours converged with remarkable efficiency. Inside, the place smelled of sealing wax and paper. Behind the polished counter stood Mrs. Pike, spectacles perched low on her nose, sorting envelopes into neat pigeonholes. She looked up with relief as Miss Marple entered. Ah, Miss Marple, if you've come for stamps, you'll find them in short supply today. I've been run ragged since breakfast, people wanting to know if I still have that wretched letter. Miss Marple offered her a kind smile. Indeed. I thought it might be rather a morning for inquiries. She set her basket on the counter. I need a card for my goddaughter, but I also wondered if I might trouble you about the judge's correspondence yesterday. Mrs. Pike hesitated, then lowered her voice. There isn't much to tell. The letter was slipped in sometime after the early delivery. No stamp, as I said. The envelope was plain cream, good quality. I placed it on his tray with the rest. She shook her head. I never imagined, well. You did perfectly, Miss Marple assured her. Did anyone linger nearby when you brought in the afternoon post? Mrs. Pike considered. Now you mention it. Miss Redfern was crossing from the library about then. And young Fletcher brought a parcel for Mrs. Linton, but he went straight out again. Oh, and Mr. Durrant, the solicitor's clerk, came to ask about a registered packet. Miss Marple nodded, storing the names away. Her gaze drifted over the counter to the battered wooden table where outgoing letters waited for collection. A faint scatter of ash lay near the edge, as though someone had tapped a cigarette there. She traced the mark lightly with a gloved finger. You don't allow smoking in here, do you, Mrs. Pike? Certainly not. I swept that only yesterday. Mrs. Pike frowned, clearly affronted. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. A bell jingled as the door opened. Gerald Hargreaves stepped in, looking harried. He purchased a half-dozen stamps and muttered about sending notes to friends. Miss Marple, observing from the corner of her eye, saw that his envelope supply was already in his coat pocket. Heavy cream paper, identical to Mrs. Pike's description of the mysterious letter. Gerald caught her glance and coloured faintly before leaving at once. Well, Mrs. Pike exclaimed. If that young man thinks he'll post things without the whole village noticing, he's mistaken. Miss Marple did not comment. Instead, she ordered a postal order for a small sum, a perfect excuse to keep talking. During the transaction, she gently steered conversation to past customers, hearing that the judge had lately received several anonymous envelopes, always typed, always delivered by hand rather than postmarked. When she stepped back into the street, the sunlight had turned sharp and clear, burning off the last traces of mist. She paused by the war memorial, knitting bag looped over her arm, and reviewed her discoveries. Gerald with matching stationery, ashes by the outgoing letters, a series of unstamped notes. A web was forming, delicate, but strong if one knew where to anchor the strands. And in Miss Marple's experience, every village post office, with its paper trails and unguarded chatter, held the first knots of many a tangled story. Chapter 8. Secrets at Rose Cottage. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had drifted in from the downs, laying a silvery light across Marlecombe. Miss Marple, having taken a modest luncheon with Mrs. Linton, decided that a stroll towards Rose Cottage might be just the thing for digestion. In truth, The name of that dwelling had come up too often in village talk to ignore. The lane curved past paddocks and an old orchard before ending at a low gate hung with climbing roses. Rose Cottage itself was a tidy little dwelling, its thatch slightly uneven, as though it had been mended by different hands over the years. Smoke curled from a narrow chimney, and the sound of clippers carried from the garden. Old Mr. Trench, the cottage's tenant and sometime gardener at the vicarage, looked up from pruning a rambling briar. His weathered face brightened at sight of the visitor. "Afternoon, miss. Fine day for roses, though they're nearly spent." Miss Marple agreed pleasantly and admired his blooms, giving him time to settle before she spoke of other matters. "I hear," she began, turning the conversation with practiced ease, "that Judge Hargreaves had reason to come this way yesterday." Trench lowered his clippers, eyes narrowing in thought. "Aye, he did, about 3 o'clock, I reckon. I was fetching compost from the shed when I saw him at the bend of the lane. He weren't alone, either." "Indeed." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her interest sharpened. "There was a lady with him," Trench continued. "Tallish, in a grey coat, veil pulled down over her face. They stopped by the stile yonder, spoke a while. Looked serious, if you take my meaning." "Did you hear anything of their talk?" "Not a word, miss. Wind was against me. But when they parted, she went off toward the woods, and he headed back across the meadow." Miss Marple thanked him kindly, then asked after his roses again, letting the matter rest. As they talked, she noted a set of fresh boot prints by the stile, half hidden where the grass gave way to mud. They were smaller than a man's, neat and narrow, pressed deep as though the wearer had paused there some time. On her return walk she paused by the meadow, gazing across at the judge's house, its windows reflecting the dull sky. A grey-clad woman, a secret meeting, a letter delivered by hand, the threads were beginning to cross one another. Back at Mrs. Linton's, she found the good lady busied with embroidery and eager for news. Miss Marple merely said that Mr. Trench's roses were thriving despite the season. Yet inwardly she turned over the image of that veiled figure waiting by the stile. Whoever she was, Miss Marple felt sure she had carried something more than a bouquet in her hands that afternoon. Perhaps the message that had drawn a respected judge to his death behind a locked door. Chapter 9. A Lock with No Key. The following morning broke sharp and cold, with a faint sheen of frost on Marlecomb's hedgerows. Miss Marple, already neat in her dove-grey coat, set out along the lane to the judge's house. She had received a discreet note from Inspector Graves. The police had completed their preliminary search, and she might look at the study if she wished, provided she touched nothing. Judge Hargreaves's home, the Laurels, stood a little apart from the village, a square Georgian building with ivy climbing up one wing. A constable admitted her gravely, leading her through a hall lined with legal portraits to the room where the tragedy had occurred. It was an austere chamber. Tall bookcases, a heavy desk, dark red curtains half drawn against the light. Yet it held the peculiar stillness of a room that has lately known violence. The chair where the judge had been found sat angled from the desk. Chalk marks on the carpet showed the place where his body had slumped. Miss Marple's gaze moved at once to the door and its large brass key. Graves, standing nearby, explained, "Door was locked on the inside. Key still in the barrel when we forced entry. Windows fastened. No sign of tampering." "And the letter?" she asked softly. Graves pointed to an envelope inside a glass evidence sleeve. "Plain cream paper, typed sheet. Only a few words. You will answer for what you did. Signed with a single initial, R." Miss Marple examined the sill of the nearest window, noting faint scratches where the paint had flaked. "Do you allow for the possibility," she murmured, "that the room might have been secured after the fact?" Graves raised an eyebrow. "You mean, someone staged it?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling though her mouth remained solemn. "Locked rooms are rarely as obliging as they seem." She studied the fireplace, ashes swept too clean, as though someone had taken pains to remove every scrap. Then the carpet, where a faint indentation suggested that something once stood between desk and hearth, a small stool, perhaps, or a box. A shelf near the desk caught her attention. Its books had been pushed tight together, yet a thin line of dust marked where a volume had recently been drawn out. She traced the space with one gloved finger. "Have you learned anything of the judge's visitors yesterday?" she asked. "Only his clerk, young Durrant, and Gerald Hargreaves," said Graves. "He also went for a short walk mid-afternoon. Trench saw him on the lane, speaking with a veiled lady." "Indeed," Miss Marple said quietly. She paced the room once more, pausing by the desk. A single blot of ink marred the leather surface, oddly far from the inkwell. Near it lay a tiny scrap of rose petal, browned at the edges. Graves followed her glance. We assumed that blew in when we opened the window. Miss Marple bent closer. Perhaps, she murmured, but petals rarely travel alone. If we were to search the grounds near the stile by Rose Cottage, we might find more than roses. As she departed, she left the inspector with a polite smile and a request to keep the key in his pocket and not to let anyone tidy the fireplace until she had had another look. Out in the chill air, she tightened her scarf and considered the strange symmetry of the scene. A sealed chamber, a warning letter, and a single faded petal, all whispering that Judge Hargreaves's death had been planned with delicacy and with someone's steady hand on the latch. Chapter 10. The Petal in the Ashes. Rain blew in fine silver threads across Marlecombe the next morning, beading on the hedgerows and streaking the windows of Mrs. Linton's parlour. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire with her knitting, though her thoughts were far from her needles. That solitary petal found in the judge's study would not leave her mind. Pale pink once, now browned at the edges, a rose, most likely. But what rose, and from whose garden? When the weather cleared a little, she wrapped herself in a stout cloak and set out along the dripping lanes. Her first stop was Rose Cottage, where the briars had been beaten low by the rain. Mr. Trench greeted her with a mug of steaming tea and invited her inside. The room smelled faintly of damp earth and rose leaves drying in a bowl on the sill. "Lost another judge up the lane, have we?" he said gloomily. "Can't make sense of it, miss." "None of us can, Mr. Trench," Miss Marple replied, "though I dare say sense may come with time." She inquired after the roses that grew closest to the stile. Trench shook his head. The last blooms had been cut only the day before the tragedy. He had left a small basket of them on the cottage bench. Someone, he admitted, might have taken one. Outside, Miss Marple examined the ground where she had noticed the neat boot prints. Rain had softened the soil, but she could still see the faint suggestion of narrow heels turned toward the meadow path. A few wilted petals clung to the brambles nearby, their pink close to the color of the scrap in the judge's room. Her next call was at the Laurels, where Inspector Graves was waiting with a cup of tea and a worried brow. He produced a small envelope from his pocket. Inside lay several minute ashes sifted from the fireplace. "Not much to go on," he said apologetically. "But look, a charred corner of paper, and here a fragment of green stem." Miss Marple examined the stem, its thorns scorched to black dots. "So," she said, "our visitor brought roses, and burnt the rest." "Why?" asked Graves. "Perhaps," she mused, "because a single blossom, given meaning, can speak louder than words, and because the others, if left, might betray where they had been gathered." She moved about the study, her gaze light yet thorough. At the hearth she crouched, peering into the narrow gap between grate and wall. With the aid of a paper knife she drew out a tiny object, a pin, the sort used to fasten a hat veil. Graves looked startled. "That could be from your mysterious grey lady." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Indeed. One must never underestimate the evidence left by a well-dressed woman." She replaced the pin carefully and turned to the window. Beyond the glass, the garden gleamed with moisture, every leaf polished by rain. She thought of the veiled figure, of roses gathered in haste, of a letter typed and unsigned, and of a man who had locked his own door, or allowed someone to lock it for him. As she left, she spoke softly to Graves. "I should like to know who, in our quiet village, owns a grey coat fine enough for an afternoon meeting, and who might value roses as more than decoration. Also, perhaps, who keeps a typewriter close to hand." The inspector promised to make inquiries. Miss Marple, stepping out into the thin drizzle, felt the story tightening, a net drawing closer, woven of petals, paper, and secrets long buried beneath the village calm. Chapter 11. Whispers in the Library. The rain had settled into a steady, silver drizzle by afternoon, lending the village green an air of soft desolation. Miss Marple, umbrella neatly furled at the library door, shook the drops from her cloak before stepping inside. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax polish. Lamps cast warm puddles of light on rows of well-thumbed volumes. Behind the counter, Miss Redfern, tall, angular, and prim in a slate-blue cardigan, looked up from a pile of cataloguing cards. "Good day, Miss Marple. I don't suppose you've come to borrow anything with too many murders in it," she said, with the faintest twitch of humour. "Only information, my dear," Miss Marple replied, voice mild but eyes alert. A quiet corner where one may read is sometimes the best place for hearing truths. Miss Redfern led her to a table near the periodicals. Only 2 other readers occupied the room, a young clerk poring over the Times, and Gerald Hargreaves seated by the window, leafing aimlessly through a gardening manual. He looked up, saw Miss Marple, and quickly returned to his pages. Miss Marple busied herself with a volume on horticulture, waiting. Before long, Gerald rose and approached the counter to ask Miss Redfern about books on rose cultivation. Miss Marple, apparently absorbed in her reading, caught a fragment of their talk. Hybrid teas, pale pink, something hardy, with a long stem, Gerald was saying. Miss Redfern suggested Queen Alexandra or peace. His answers were vague, as though roses were not truly his subject. After Gerald left, Miss Marple returned the book and engaged the librarian in conversation about village gardens. Miss Redfern, pleased to talk, mentioned that she herself kept a few climbing roses at her cottage, though nothing as grand as Mr. Trent's briars. She added, almost as an afterthought, that the late judge had borrowed a legal history only 2 days before, and that a certain typed letter had arrived for him via the library's message tray, quite unorthodox, really. A letter. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. How very obliging of you to mention it. Yes, Miss Redfern said, lowering her voice. Someone left it with me, asked that it be placed inside the book for the judge. I assumed it was a note from Chambers. A cream envelope, no stamp. When the inspector questioned me, I realized how odd it was. Miss Marple thanked her warmly, noting how the color rose in the librarian's cheeks as she spoke. She wandered among the shelves a while longer, her fingers brushing bindings until they paused on a narrow volume about English roses. She slipped it free and examined the flyleaf. There, almost hidden in pencil, was a faint set of initials, RH or perhaps RF, scrawled in haste. Outside, mist clung to the grass. Gerald's figure was already vanishing into it. Coat collar turned up. Miss Marple stood for a moment, umbrella poised, and allowed herself a tiny smile. Books, letters, roses, and the locked room itself, they were starting to speak to her, though still in whispers. And Miss Marple had learned, long ago, that whispers often told the truest stories. Chapter 12. A Question of Stationery. Morning sunlight spilled through Mrs. Linton's sitting-room windows, picking out the gilt on a row of framed samplers. Miss Marple, seated with a modest breakfast tray before her, was turning over a square of stiff cream paper, the same paper on which Judge Hargreaves had received his warning. Inspector Graves, invited for coffee, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. You're thinking, he said, breaking a scone in half. I often do, Inspector, Miss Marple replied serenely. But today I'm thinking about paper. She tapped the envelope with a finger. Good quality, heavy, the sort supplied by stationers rather than the village shop. And notice, no watermark, but an almost imperceptible ridge where a crest was once pressed and then carefully scraped away. Graves examined the edge with a magnifier and whistled softly. Deliberate, then. Someone wanted this to look ordinary. Precisely, said Miss Marple. I should like to know who, in Marlacombe or nearby, has recently purchased such writing paper. By mid-morning she was strolling through the high street, stopping first at the little stationery counter inside Broom's Emporium. Mrs. Broom, plump and genial, produced an array of envelopes for inspection, but none matched. She did, however, recall that Gerald Hargreaves had ordered something special only a fortnight before, a box of plain cream sheets, cut to legal size, cash on delivery. From there Miss Marple made her way to the solicitor's office, where Mr. Durrant flushed uncomfortably at her questions. He admitted that Judge Hargreaves had occasionally asked him to fetch supplies from a printer in Brenton, a larger town 5 miles away. The judge liked a tidy letter, Durrant said, but I didn't fetch any last week. Someone else must have. A final call at the post office yielded another crumb. Mrs. Pike remembered that a parcel wrapped in brown paper, looked like a box of stationery, had been collected by a tall woman in a grey coat 3 days before the murder. Said it was for the judge, Mrs. Pike added. I thought nothing of it at the time. As Miss Marple walked back along the lane, she reflected on how the trail of paper connected several threads. Gerald's curious interest in roses, Miss Redfern's discreet delivery of a message, a veiled woman claiming parcels. All of them, in some way, had handled the means by which a death sentence reached the study at the Laurels. The sun was warm now, drawing scent from late roses along the hedgerow. Miss Marple paused to admire them, eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. The solution, she felt, was close, but the pattern was not yet complete. Somewhere in the village, hidden behind polite smiles and everyday errands, lay the one hand that had written doom on cream paper and set the latch against a man's life. Chapter 13, Afternoon at the Laurels. The clouds of early afternoon hung low over Marlecombe, casting a pewter light across the village. Miss Marple, wrapped in her soft grey shawl, approached the Laurels at a pace that suggested nothing more urgent than a social call. Yet her thoughts were brisk and searching. Inspector Graves met her at the door. "I'm glad you came, Gerald Hargreaves has just arrived. Says he left a notebook here and wants to collect it." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though she merely said, "How very forgetful of him." They entered the hallway, where Gerald stood shifting his weight, hat in hand. He greeted them with nervous cheer and followed Graves into the study. The room was as it had been, papers stacked neatly, the judge's chair solemn in its corner, the fireplace swept but for the faint shadow of ash. Miss Marple let her gaze drift to the curtains. They were drawn halfway, and one cord hung oddly loose, as if recently untied. "Is that where the key was found?" she asked, pointing to the lock. Graves nodded. Still no sign of tampering. Miss Marple stepped to the hearth, her glance falling on the ash scuttle. A fine dust of char clung to its rim, darker than the rest. With her knitting needle, conveniently brought along, she prodded gently and drew out a tiny ball of wax, hardened and faintly scented of roses. Gerald leaned forward. "What is it?" "Sealing wax," Miss Marple said lightly. "Used to close envelopes, or, on occasion, to fix a latch." She looked up at him with mild curiosity. "Did you ever see your uncle use such a thing?" Gerald flushed. "He sealed certain private papers, yes." "Ah." She turned to Graves. "Might we examine the desk drawers?" Graves obliged, producing a shallow tray of the judge's personal effects. Among pens, nibs, and paper knives lay a slim box of wax sticks, red, blue, and cream. One was missing from the cream row. As they talked, a knock sounded on the open door. Miss Redfern stood there, library bag over one arm. "Inspector, I thought you might want this," she said, holding out a ledger. "It's the record of books delivered to the judge." Her hand trembled slightly as Graves thanked her. Miss Marple noted the movement, and also the faint perfume that clung to the ledger's cover, a floral scent, sweeter than roses, and faintly smoky, as if it had brushed a hearth. When Miss Redfern departed, Gerald made an excuse to leave as well, taking his forgotten notebook. Miss Marple watched them both from the window. Two figures heading in opposite directions along the lane, yet bound, she suspected, by threads they did not wish her to see. Graves sighed. "You think they're hiding something?" "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her eyes resting on the quiet study. "In a small place such as this, everyone hides something. The question is which secret would drive a person to murder behind a locked door." She glanced once more at the ball of rose-scented wax in her palm, then tucked it into a tiny envelope. Outside, the autumn light was slipping towards evening, and a faint breeze stirred the curtains, as though the house itself remembered the moment its calm was broken. Chapter 14, Shadows at Dusk. A pale, wintry light lingered over Marlecombe as the day slipped toward evening. Miss Marple, returning from the Laurels, paused halfway along the lane to fasten the clasp of her shawl. Beyond the hedge, a lone rook called before wheeling toward the woods, its dark shape cutting against the fading sky. She had arranged to take tea with Mrs. Linton, yet a thought tugged at her, the stile near Rose Cottage, the place where Judge Hargreaves had been seen with a veiled lady. The air was growing cool, but she turned her steps toward the meadow path. The stile stood quiet among the long shadows. Miss Marple rested a hand on the worn timber and surveyed the ground. The rain had washed most traces away, but beneath a tuft of grass something pale caught her eye, a sliver of paper, softened by damp. She teased it free with care. The fragment bore half a line of typing, "You will answer," in the same sharp font as the letter found in the study. As she straightened, the wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of smoke and roses. She turned, and in the gloom a figure was just visible at the far end of the hedge. Tall, in a grey coat, head bent as though searching the ground. Before she could speak, the person slipped away toward the trees, leaving only the whisper of wet leaves. Miss Marple tucked the paper safely into her bag and walked on, mind calm but quick. A letter delivered here, roses gathered, a meeting that ended in death, all converging at this lonely spot. By the time she reached Mrs. Linton's gate, dusk had thickened to velvet. Inside, lamps glowed warmly, and Mrs. Linton fussed about the hearth. "Such a chill tonight," she exclaimed, pressing a cup of tea into her guest's hands. One could almost believe the place haunted, with everyone creeping about. Miss Marple smiled gently. "People rarely creep without reason, my dear." She sipped her tea, letting the firelight dance in her eyes. Behind her polite composure, thoughts were settling like well-laid stitches. Gerald's hasty visit to the Laurels, Miss Redfern's trembling hands, the wax that smelled of roses, and now this sodden scrap on the meadow path. A shadow stretched across the quiet village, and somewhere within it stood the one who had written doom on cream paper and arranged for silence behind a locked door. Outside, the rook called again, solitary in the dusk. Miss Marple looked toward the window, a faint smile playing about her lips. She had learned long ago that darkness often sharpens the outlines of hidden things, and that patience, like knitting, could untangle even the knottiest threads. Chapter 15. Tea and Confidences. The storm that threatened at dusk never quite arrived. Instead, a soft rain ticked gently at the panes of Mrs. Linton's parlour, blurring the lamplight into halos. Miss Marple sat by the hearth with a cup of Darjeeling, her knitting resting in a neat coil on her lap. Mrs. Linton, all bustle and warmth, poured more tea and chattered with the eagerness of one who has long been waiting to speak. "My dear Jane, I can't bear the tension in the village," she said, setting down the pot with a clink. "First the dreadful business with poor Judge Hargreaves, and now people seeing shadows on the paths. One hardly dares fetch the milk." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic murmur, though her eyes were thoughtful behind their twinkle. "Fear has a way of stirring tongues, dear, and sometimes of loosening them." Mrs. Linton leaned forward conspiratorially. "You must promise not to think me fanciful, but I cannot help wondering about that nephew of his, Gerald. He has always seemed pleasant enough, but lately he's so distracted. Yesterday he came to the house looking pale, as if he'd been running. Said he wanted to collect some papers his uncle kept for him." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Papers?" "Some old family letters, I believe. But he barely stayed 5 minutes, and when I offered tea he declined, Gerald, who never used to refuse cake." Mrs. Linton shook her head, earrings bobbing. "And then there's Miss Redfern. She called not an hour later, asking if the judge had left any books with me. She seemed anxious, poor thing, though she pretended it was only for the library records." Miss Marple sipped her tea, considering. "It's interesting, is it not, how books and papers move about so quietly, and how very important they become when someone wishes them not to be seen." Mrs. Linton sighed, leaning back. "You always see farther than the rest of us. I only hope you'll tell me once you've discovered the truth." "I shall do my best," Miss Marple said gently. She looked into the fire, where the flames curled like question marks around the logs. "The truth, I think, lies not in what people say they have lost, but in what they are most careful to keep." For a while they sat companionably, the ticking of the clock filling the room. Outside, the rain softened to mist, and the garden glimmered faintly in the lamplight. When at last Miss Marple rose to leave, she felt the puzzle tightening, a wax-scented clue, a letter fragment by the style, papers that flitted from hand to hand. Someone in Marlecombe feared discovery enough to risk a meeting at dusk, and a carefully staged locked room. As she stepped into the damp night, a quiet determination settled over her. Secrets were like threads in wool. Patient fingers could draw them out, knot by knot, until the whole design showed itself plainly. Chapter 16. Evening Visitors. A pale moon floated above Marlecombe that night, silvering the cobbles and the damp hedgerows. Miss Marple, comfortably settled by Mrs. Linton's parlour fire, was threading a length of wool through her needles when the faint crunch of steps sounded on the gravel outside. Mrs. Linton looked up, startled. At this hour? Who can it be? Before Miss Marple could reply, a brisk knock came at the door. Mrs. Linton bustled to answer, revealing Inspector Graves framed against the lamplit porch. Drops of mist clung to the shoulders of his overcoat. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, stepping inside, "but something's turned up at the Laurels. I thought you ought to know, Miss Marple." He placed a small, sooty envelope on the table. "One of my constables searched the judge's ash bin again this evening. Found this wedged at the very bottom." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the envelope. Its flap had been sealed with cream wax, now cracked and brittle. On the front, faintly legible despite smudges, was a single initial, R. Inside lay a folded sheet, its top edge burnt away. The surviving words read, "Not the first to suffer. You will answer for Rosehill." Rosehill. Mrs. Linton repeated. "That's the name of the old house across the valley, the one left empty since the war." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Indeed, my dear. And also the name of a certain scandal, if memory serves, one involving a disputed inheritance." Graves looked grim. "I've asked for the Rosehill files to be fetched from county records. But that isn't all." He hesitated, then added, "A witness swears they saw a tall figure near the ash bin just after dark yesterday, grey coat, scarf pulled up." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Did they see whether it was a man or woman?" "Couldn't say. Only that the person moved quickly, as though hiding something." She considered the letter again, fingers light on the brittle paper. A second warning, perhaps, or an accusation. And someone risking much to destroy it. Outside, the moon slid behind a cloud, and the room dimmed. Mrs. Linton drew the curtains with a shiver. Miss Marple remained still, mind quietly working. Rosehill, roses, a sealed envelope in the ashes, all converging like the threads of her knitting, forming a pattern just discernible to the patient eye. At last she spoke, voice calm and precise. "Inspector, we must learn who has been at Rosehill in recent weeks. I fancy the key to our puzzle lies not only behind a locked door, but behind the shutters of that deserted house." Graves inclined his head. "I'll see to it in the morning." When the inspector departed, silence settled over the parlor. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, but her gaze drifted to the window where moonlight now spilled across the garden. Somewhere in the stillness, she sensed, another visitor was already abroad, someone who feared the truth would not stay buried forever. Chapter 17. The Empty House at Rosehill. Morning broke with a low mist clinging to the hedgerows, softening the stone walls and the russet roofs of Marlecombe. Miss Marple, walking stick in hand, set out along the lane that led to Rosehill. The path wound through meadows, where sheep loomed like ghosts in the haze, and the scent of wet earth rose with every step. The old house stood at the top of a slope, half hidden behind a screen of overgrown laurels. Its once white facade was mottled with lichen, shutters hung crooked, and ivy clawed across a sagging balcony. Even from a distance, it gave off a sense of watchfulness, as though it had been keeping its own counsel for years. Miss Marple paused at the gate. The lock was rusty but not stiff, recently oiled, she noted. She pushed it open, careful not to let it squeal, and followed the gravel sweep towards the porch. There she crouched to study the ground, faint prints in the damp grit, one larger than the other, heel to toe, as if two people had walked together and stopped by the door. Inside, the air smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, like dried roses. Curtains hung limp against the windows, letting in a subdued light. Miss Marple moved slowly through the rooms, a parlor with faded wallpaper, a library where a single chair had been dragged from its usual place, leaving a pale patch in the rug. On the mantel lay the remains of a candle, its wax pulled down the side as though it had been left to gutter. Upstairs, she found a small study overlooking the garden. Papers lay in a careless heap on the desk, invoices, letters dated years back, and a single slip of newer parchment bearing the crest of the Hargreaves family. Its corner had been torn, as if someone had tried to remove a name. She slipped it carefully into her reticule for later examination. A soft creak behind her made her pause. She turned, expecting the inspector, but the landing was empty. Only the ticking of an unseen clock disturbed the hush. Yet she could not rid herself of the impression that someone had been standing quite near, listening. Downstairs again, Miss Marple let herself into the garden. Beyond the tangled roses lay an overgrown orchard, a plank of wood jutted from beneath the roots of an old apple tree. She stooped, brushing aside leaves, and revealed the corner of a small tin box. The padlock was gone, snapped clean through. Whatever had once been hidden there was no longer present. Miss Marple straightened, smoothing her gloves. The orchard whispered in the breeze, carrying the scent of damp petals. The threads of the mystery were drawing closer together, the sealed letter in the ashes, the judge's locked study, and now this deserted house with its vanished secret. As she retraced her steps to the lane, the sun finally broke through the mist, scattering silver over the fields. Miss Marple's expression was serene, but her eyes were keen as ever. Someone in Marlecombe had risked. Chapter 18. Shadows Among the Roses. The sun, though pale, had gained a pleasant warmth by mid-afternoon. Miss Marple sat on a wooden bench in Mrs. Linton's back garden, a basket of wool beside her. Beyond the clipped hedge, the rose beds of Marlecombe Hall glowed in soft pinks and creams, their fragrance drifting lazily through the air. Mrs. Linton was snipping faded blooms with brisk precision. "I thought a little tidy-up might cheer us," she said, glancing anxiously at the path that led towards the orchard. "One can hardly sit indoors waiting for dreadful news." Miss Marple smiled faintly and set a row of neat stitches. Gardening is a most soothing occupation, and very revealing, sometimes. People often choose where to linger in a garden according to what troubles them. Mrs. Linton gave a distracted laugh, then straightened suddenly. "There," she whispered. "Did you see?" A slim figure had appeared beyond the hedge, someone in a dove-grey coat, half concealed by the climbing roses. The person paused, as though measuring the distance between the house and the orchard. Then, noticing they were observed, they turned sharply and vanished down the slope towards the river. "Not one of the gardeners," Mrs. Linton murmured. "Too careful." Miss Marple rose, brushing off a petal that had fallen on her sleeve. She followed the line of trampled grass where the stranger had passed, noting how the stems were bent, not broken, and how a faint whiff of tobacco hung in the still air. She stooped to pick up a scrap caught on a thorn, a sliver of grey wool, torn clean from a sleeve. Back on the bench, she tucked the fragment into her reticule, her eyes thoughtful. "Whoever it was," she said softly, "has grown bold. To prowl in daylight suggests either desperation or an overconfidence born of thinking they are not suspected." Mrs. Linton sank beside her. "Jane, you do make it sound alarming." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the path. "Not alarming, my dear, merely instructive. We must ask ourselves why they risked a visit today, when the village is full of eyes. Perhaps something at Rosehill is not yet secured, or perhaps they hope to learn what we know." The roses trembled in a sudden breeze, scattering petals across the grass. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, but her attention was far from the needles. There were footsteps on more than one path now, hers, the inspector's, Gerald's, Miss Redfern's, and the unknown visitor's, winding steadily towards a meeting point none of them could yet see. Above the village, church bells began their quiet chime for evensong, a reminder that time, like mystery, waits for no one. Chapter 19. Secrets at Evensong. The bells of St. Mildred's drifted over Marlecombe in mellow waves, calling the faithful to evensong. The little church, perched above the river, glowed in the fading light, its windows catching the last blush of the sun. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes early, shawl folded neatly about her shoulders. She greeted the verger, then slipped into a pew near the back where she could observe without being observed too much herself. Villagers filed in, Mrs. Linton, smoothing her gloves, Gerald Hargreaves, pale beneath his polite smile, Miss Redfern, slipping quietly to a seat by the organ loft. Inspector Graves entered last, standing unobtrusively by the south door, eyes scanning the congregation. The service began. Soft chanting floated through the nave, mingling with the faint scent of beeswax. Candles flickered along the stone walls. Miss Marple listened, head bowed, but her mind was alive, fitting the day's discoveries into place. The broken padlock at Rosehill, the burnt letter in the judge's ash bin, the figure among the roses. Halfway through the prayers, she noticed Gerald's hands trembling as he turned the pages of his hymn book. Miss Redfern glanced towards him, quick and furtive, then looked down. A few rows ahead, Mrs. Linton stared fixedly at the altar but seemed not to hear a word. When the blessing was given, the congregation moved out into the cool evening. The air smelled of damp leaves and faint wood smoke. Miss Marple stepped aside to let others pass, then watched as Gerald lingered by the porch, speaking low to Miss Redfern. Their faces were shadowed, but their stance was tense, almost pleading. Inspector Graves joined her. "You saw it too," he murmured. "I did," Miss Marple replied softly. "Whatever binds those two is pressing harder now. And I fancy they are not the only ones carrying burdens." From the Lych gate came a sharp crack, a branch snapping underfoot. All turned, but whoever had caused it was already retreating into the dark beyond the churchyard wall. Only a trace of movement in the hedge betrayed their passage. "Another watcher," Graves muttered, starting forward. "Let them go," Miss Marple advised, touching his sleeve. "We'll learn more by patience than by a chase in the dusk." As the villagers dispersed down the lanes, Miss Marple stood for a moment under the first stars. The evening seemed peaceful, but in the quiet she sensed the faintest tremor of danger, like a current under still water. Somewhere close, a secret was waiting for the right hand to lift it out. She tucked her shawl more firmly about her and began the walk back to the vicarage, her thoughts as orderly as the steps of the service, yet alive with possibilities. Chapter 20. A Confession by Candlelight. A chill settled over Marlecombe that night, and the lamps along the high street flickered as though uneasy in the breeze. Miss Marple, after a modest supper with Mrs. Linton, excused herself and returned to her lodgings at the vicarage. She had barely settled her shawl on the arm of a chair when a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's housekeeper, peered in, holding a candle. "There's someone to see you, Miss Marple. Says it's urgent." The visitor stood in the hall, shoulders hunched inside a rain-dark coat. Gerald Hargreaves removed his hat with a tremulous hand. The wavering light made hollows of his eyes. "May I come in?" he asked. Miss Marple nodded and guided him to the sitting room. She set the candle on the mantel, its glow casting long shadows over the chintz and polished wood. Gerald perched on the edge of the sofa, clasping his gloves as though they might steady him. "I can't bear it any longer," he said at last, voice roughened by strain. "I keep thinking of my uncle's study, the locked drawer, He stopped, swallowed hard. "Miss Marple, I didn't kill him, but I was there that night." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her face calm. "Take your time, Mr. Hargreaves. Begin where you feel you must." Gerald drew a breath. "I came to fetch papers, documents about Rosehill. Uncle refused to give them up. He said they proved something about the estate, something that would disgrace a name I cared about." His gaze flicked towards the curtained window. "We quarreled. I left angry, but alive he was, I swear. Hours later, when I heard he'd been found dead, I thought people would never believe I hadn't harmed him." "And so you hid your visit," Miss Marple said gently. He nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "I even burnt one of the letters, thinking it safest. That was wrong. But I couldn't watch everything unravel, for myself or for Lydia Redfern." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, her voice as soft as the flame. "So Miss Redfern has a part in this." "She and we were trying to put right something from years ago. Her father and mine made a dreadful muddle over Rosehill's inheritance. She feared my uncle might reveal matters that would cast suspicion on her family." His voice broke. "But she never wished him harm." Miss Marple regarded him with clear, steady eyes. "Fear, Mr. Hargreaves, is a dangerous counsellor. Yet it does not make one a murderer. There is more to this than letters and quarrels." A draught stirred the candle. The shadow of Gerald's face wavered on the wall. "I've told you all I know," he whispered. "If you believe me, I'll give myself up to Graves." "I believe you have spoken the truth as you see it," Miss Marple replied. "But we must tread carefully. Whoever struck Judge Hargreaves is still at large, and, I suspect, growing anxious." She rose and gently patted Gerald's sleeve. "Go home for now. Keep your composure, and speak to no one of this visit. There are threads still to be drawn tight, and I think the next will lead us to Rosehill once more." When the door closed behind him, Miss Marple trimmed the candle wick and sat back down. The house was very still. She laid her knitting across her knees, though she did not take up the needles. Instead, she watched the tiny flame until it burned straight and steady, like her own quiet resolve.